As a matter of fact, there is a theory out there that small amounts of radiation are actually good for your health. It sounds crazy and counterintuitive to the prevailing belief system, which is that radiation is deadly and it will give you cancer and it will give your children and your grandchildren cancer and so on. It's simply not true. I mean, it's a useful fairy tale for people that don't like nuclear energy.
The Rational View is a weekly series hosted by me, Dr. Alan Scott, providing a rational, evidence-based perspective addressing important societal issues. Hello and welcome to another episode of The Rational View. I'm your host, Dr. Al Scott. On this episode, I want to talk a little bit about some of the new nuclear technologies out there, and I've got a guest on who is a key player in the new nuclear technology arena. As always, if you like what you hear, please hit like and share it with your friends and spread the word. Canon Bryan is a financial professional with over 25 years of experience in various aspects of the finance industry. Mr. Bryan was a founding shareholder in Terrestrial Energy, where he serves as Chief Financial Operator. Terrestrial Energy is developing advanced nuclear power plants. He was also a founding shareholder of Neocorp, which is developing the largest niobium deposit in North America, and Uranium Energy Corp, where he served as VP Corporate Development. He has also served as Chief Financial Officer on the boards of directors for private and public companies in Canada and the USA. Mr. Bryan completed his professional studies in accounting with the Certified General Accountants Association of Canada. Mr. Bryan, welcome to The Rational View.
Thanks for inviting me.
So, the reason I invited you here is I'd like to explain to our listeners, and I think they're interested. I've been going over different nuclear technologies and the pros and cons of nuclear and the energy system in the world, and nuclear as a solution to climate change. And one of the things that has gotten a lot of press lately is all the new nuclears, the SMRs, the Small Modular Reactors, and the thorium, and the different salts that are being used. And in your role at Terrestrial Energy, you are at the vanguard of new nuclear. Could you explain for our listeners what the Terrestrial Energy reactor technology is?
Sure, to the extent that I can. I'm not a technical person. I have no scientific training. I'm the financial officer of the company. But I do obviously have some understanding of how my company's technology works. So I will try to provide a brief overview of that. So it is a molten salt reactor technology. It's called the Integral Molten Salt Reactor, or IMSR, and it's based on a set of designs that was developed by the Oak Ridge National Lab, principally back in the 1950s and 60s, culminating in a prototype experiment called the Molten Salt Reactor Experiment, or MSRE. They operated one of these molten salt reactors for almost 5 years. It was a small system, but it really proved a lot of the design claims. And in principle, the way it works is it utilizes a uranium fuel kernel, which is chemically bound to its own coolant, which is fluoride in the form of a liquid fluoride salt. So the uranium fluoride operates as a liquid fluoride salt in a naturally high temperature environment as a liquid at 700 degrees Celsius inside the reactor core. So this is quite different from conventional reactor systems, which use a solid uranium fuel and which is cooled by water, which is a eminently less chemically stable coolant and with a pretty lousy thermal range. So fluoride salt is massively chemically stable, neutronically stable, and isotopically stable, and has a phase range in the liquid phase of nearly 1,000 degrees C. So it makes a much, much better coolant. And the fact that the coolant is virtually impossible to separate from the fuel means that a loss of coolant accident, which is a very bad thing in the nuclear world, it has no meaning in our system. The only way you could separate the coolant from the fuel in this case would be by using some kind of really nasty reagent like nitric acid or something. So that's out of the question. So that really describes one of the principal safety factors, safety elements of the design, which is the loss of coolant accident is rendered meaningless, and the fact that it can operate at high temperature means that it operates at high temperature naturally, means that you don't have to add a whole bunch of pressure inside the reactor core to artificially increase the temperature, to engineer the increase of the temperature of the coolant, like you have to do with water. So no pressure in the reactor vessel equals a very good thing, because you're taking away physical forces that represent a safety challenge. The reactor itself is small. That means it doesn't have to be fabricated on site. So all of those types of design construction challenges are removed, and the costs of all of those engineered safety systems are eliminated.
So it sounds like a streamlined version.
Yeah, and what the technology or what the reactor system delivers, in fact, is not electricity, but hot molten salt. It's the exact same kind of salt that you would find, for example, in a CSP or a concentrated solar plant. And that hot salt goes to the customer. The customer can do whatever they want with it. They can make electricity, which they most likely would do in many cases, or they can use it in an industrial process that requires a lot of heat.
That's one of the key things that we need to replace if we're trying to displace fossil fuels, of course, is the high temperature industrial processing. And obviously, if you're making electricity with your solar panels and your wind, it's not as easy to do high temperature industrial processes. And that's one of the biggest challenges, I think, in replacing fossil fuels, is getting to the temperatures you need to melt steel and do all the sorts of things that people do with coal and fossil fuels, right?
Well, that is right. A lot of people don't realize it, but the industrial sector is responsible for roughly 30% of global emissions. And it's 100% powered by fossil fuels, and there's really no known substitute right now. To make that heat cleanly and cost competitively for fossil fuels is just something that doesn't exist. It's never existed since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution until now. Now you have these high temperature systems, and IMSR is not the only one. There are others that deliver high temperature power, and that is promising because it means that for the first time we can contemplate an industrial economy with primary manufacturing at the scale that we need it, without dumping massive amounts of CO2 into the atmosphere.
Indeed. And does the molten salt reactor technology have an advantage over, say, your typical light water reactor technology in this regard?
It does, yes. It's because it operates at a higher temperature. That's the key reason. So conventional light water reactor systems, I guess, would normally, because they have water as a coolant, they would normally be operating at 100 degrees C. But because of what I mentioned before about how they have to increase the temperature using pressure to make the electricity, they actually operate at around 290 degrees C, but only after adding 160 atmospheres of pressure into the reactor core. So that's so 290 degrees C that's conventional. And
that's just not enough for thermal processing in industry. You need 700, 800 degrees to do any sort of melting of metal, right?
It's enough for some things. So when you look at the world of industrial processing, for all of there's thousands of different things that we do industrially, and some of them require relatively low temperatures, like pulp and paper, I think, is relatively low. but like things like steel, yes, good example. Typically 1600, in the neighborhood of 1600 C.
Oh, yeah, that's high.
Yeah, it's pretty high. So it's a lot more difficult to get there with a 290 degrees C output than it would be with, say, 600, 650, or some of these other advanced reactor systems that I think operate at around 1000 C. So yeah, that's definitely an advantage. So and so the proof is that conventional nuclear systems have never been involved in industrial heat production commercially.
Sure. So a lot of the people who have thought about this, and it's a very small minority of the people that are thinking about replacing fossil fuels, replacing the industrial heat applications, have suggested that a hydrogen economy might do the job. Does the existence of an ISR reactor supplant the need for hydrogen in the new economy?
I would never use that word, supplant. I mean, in my view, we need every plausible solution that we can possibly throw at the problem if we want to mitigate climate change and energy poverty, the dual challenges. It's not going to be replacing, let's say, hydrogen fuel cell cars. But on the other hand, an IMSR, its high temperature output could be used to do the chemical processing required to make synthetic transport fuel, like synthetic gasoline, which is drop-in substitutable and carbon neutral. So in that sense, oh yes, then you could compete with hydrogen, or you could supplement hydrogen, which is what I prefer to say. I don't think there's any technology, any energy technology out there which is just going to totally monopolize delivering energy. I don't think that's realistic. So, but it's certainly it can supplement hydrogen. It'd be a very good supplement, and also it can make hydrogen.
What I guess the question is, what type of uranium does your reactor require to run? What sort of enhancement or enrichment is needed for your process?
Yeah, the good news is it takes advantage of existing supply chains and, for example, fuel, which is already well known and established in industry, supply chains, and by regulators, and that is low-enriched uranium. The level of enrichment that's used in our fuel is exactly the same level that, or less than, what has been used in the nuclear energy industry globally, commercially, civilly, for the last 60 years. So we're not reinventing the wheel on fuel. I think every other Generation 4 system, which is currently in development, does require a level of enrichment which is above the norm. That norm being 5 to 6%. Anything above that is referred to as high assay low enriched uranium. It gets a little confusing, all these different distinctions, but we use standard assay low enriched uranium, which is up to 5%, and everything over 5% is considered to be high assay low enriched uranium. At the moment, there is no commercial supply chain for high assay low enriched uranium, so that's 5 to 20%. You can certainly understand why they would want to monitor all of these levels of enrichment very closely, owing to the fact that, well, if you enrich too much, then you've got bomb-grade fuel on your hands.
That's always a risk, and it's something that causes pause when you're looking at these new Gen 4 reactors. Obviously, they can do a lot in terms of burning up a lot of fuel and being more efficient and producing less waste if they're using more of the uranium, but if you have high enrichment, then you have a risk of proliferation, and security becomes a bigger factor.
Yeah, exactly.
So this is good news.
Yeah.
What about waste production? Does this produce the same amount of waste as a typical light water reactor for the same amount of fuel, or is it?
Yeah, in a once-through cycle, essentially yes. The answer is yes. The IMSR has a tremendous capability for taking the fuel that is left in the reactor core after its limited lifetime of 7 years, and potentially reloading it into another reactor core for another 7-year campaign. We're not doing this on our initial design because it's a bit too complicated regulatorily to get through all that. But certainly for future iterations, from a chemical and industrial and practical sense, this is totally possible. And in fact, there's a nice paper which has been written co-written by Dr. David LeBlanc, who's our Chief Technology Officer. It's on our website if anybody is interested in reading that. We can achieve what's called a closed cycle for fuel, which is really, really exciting because it means that we have much, much higher fuel utilization and much, much smaller waste piles. And that's really, I think that's what the world is seeking, crying out for these days when it comes to nuclear energy.
Indeed. So what does that mean, a closed cycle for fuel? Can you maybe explain a little more about what that means to ours?
We're stretching the limits of my technical knowledge, but basically it means we can use it again. Just keep using it again and again until the fuel is utilized to a very great degree.
And that means that the end product is a lot less radioactive than otherwise.
Well, actually, this may sound counterintuitive, but it's actually much more radioactive, but for a lot less time. So the conventional waste is very low radioactivity, but for a very long time. Half-life of plutonium-239 is 24,000 years, and the rule of thumb is 10 half-lives to get back to background. So you're sort of looking at a waste pile whose most radiotoxic element is theoretically radiotoxic or more radiotoxic than background, than the way we found it in the Earth for about 240,000 years. I mean, in reality, it's not radiotoxic enough to hurt anybody after probably about, probably a few hundred. But that's not the way the world looks at it. So with a fuel that is mostly utilized, what you have left is what's called efficient products, the longest half-life of which is around 30 years. So after 300 years, 10 half-lives, you have something which is back to background. And 300 years storage of radioactive waste is a massively more tractable engineering problem than 240,000 years of storage.
Indeed. And because are you burning more of the uranium then, or getting more efficiency out of the mined fuel?
That's exactly it. Yes. Again, this is a future permutation of our design. This is not embedded in our first commercial demonstration, which we're developing now. But it's definitely a reality for the future, and one that I think is very, very exciting.
Indeed, that does sound interesting. So tell me a little bit about the company Terrestrial Energy. How long has it been around? What's the development roadmap to get this to commercial operation? So
myself, Dr. LeBlanc, and our CEO, Simon Irish, we co-founded the company back in 2012. And from 3 people, we have now grown to over 100.
Wow, congratulations.
Thank you. Yes, it's so far been a very fun journey. We've been going through the formal pre-licensing process with the Canadian nuclear regulator called the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. The outcome of this big process is something which is very commercially valuable for us as a company, and also I think notionally for the rest of the SMR sector. And that is a formal opinion from the regulator about the safety of the design, which is not site-specific, but nevertheless a very valuable formal assessment from a world-class regulator. So that's very valuable. Most recently, we have been working with Ontario Power Generation, which is the largest electric utility company in Canada. OPG began a technology selection process over 2 years ago. They were looking at around 20 different SMR designs, and as of last October, they announced that the technology selection process has now been narrowed down to 3. And Terrestrial Energy is one of those 3. And 1 or 2 or 3, we don't know how many, of those designs will be formally selected for a major capital development at OPG's Darlington nuclear generating station, which is near Toronto in Canada.
Okay.
So we have been working very hard since that announcement was made with OPG to try to meet all of their information requirements for this technology selection process. The decision will be made this year. We will find out, and that will obviously have a big impact on our development timeline. But with or without OPG, Terrestrial Energy plans to have a commercial operating nuclear power plant, IMSR nuclear power plant, before the year 2030. We successfully applied for a $1.2 billion loan guarantee from the U.S. federal government, which can be applied to a construction project in the United States. So we're unique in that respect. Nobody else has been successful in that particular program.
Wow, that's great. What is the size of a reactor that you want to start out with? How many gigawatts are you sizing this for?
Well, it is an SMR and or small modular reactor. SMR is defined by a system which is 300 megawatts electrical or less. And so, yes, our system fits into that definition. The system that we want to build initially is 200 megawatts electrical. It's about 440 megawatts thermal.
That's a very good efficiency.
Yeah, not bad.
Thanks to the high temperature.
Yeah, the high temperature helps with that. And so, we seek to build power plants with one or more of those reactor cores. And the system is designed, or the power plant is designed, so that there can be multiple reactors operating simultaneously.
And you said that the lifetime of a fuel cycle is 7 years?
It's not the fuel cycle, it's the reactor itself. So the reactor is a disposable core. It operates for what seems to be a pretty short period of time, 7 years. So we designed a system which could never get anywhere close to bumping up against these degradation issues. So a lot of the criticism that molten salt reactor designs get is, or that molten salt reactor technology gets, is that the materials would come under too much stress, and they would not be able to handle that stress. They would degrade to the point of becoming dysfunctional. So the solution, elegantly developed by Dr. LeBlanc, is to have a limited lifetime for the core, so that that would never become an issue. So once the reactor core has finished its 7-year campaign, there's another reactor core unused, a new one sitting right beside it in the operating bay next door, ready to be connected.
Do you have a disposal plan in place for the used cores? Or can they be handled, put in a deep geological repository?
Well, we don't really speak publicly about waste handling after the life of the plant. But while the plant is operating, the cores are deposited into cooling bays.
And then you just pop in a new core. So it doesn't refuel for 7 years. It just operates continuously.
Yep, most of the fuel is loaded in before the reactor begins its operation, and but throughout the life of the core, there is some tiny amount of so-called top-up fuel, which is loaded into the system. Very little, sort of on the order of a couple of liters a day, I think it is.
Ah, okay. Are you taking fuel out at the same time? Old fuel somehow?
No, absolutely not. Fuel never leaves the core, unless, once again, in a future design we do a close cycle. But no, the way it's designed now, that's kind of the point. It's a closed, sealed system which is never opened.
That seems like a good idea. So, what do you see as the technical risks from getting from here to an operating commercial-sized reactor for this system? Are there any potential showstoppers for you? I mean, how far have you gone so far in prototyping? For one thing, have you built scale models, or do you plan to build scale models first and then scale up, or where are you in that process?
So the wonderful thing about molten-salt reactors is that there were prototypes built and operated by the Americans back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. We're not called upon to do that, to build a full-scale operating prototype. We don't need to. It's already been prototyped. So, but what we are required to do is we have to show the results of those experiments, and we can't use the data, the historical data, with the regulator. That's just not the way it works. So, in essence, we are now called upon to recreate all of those experimental outcomes. Fortunately, we know what the results are before we even start, but it does mean that we have to recreate all of those experiments. So that's the expensive bit. And we call it validation and verification. Similar to R&D, except that we already know the outcomes. So we're not creating a full-scale prototype, but we have to basically recreate all the various different pieces of a prototype separately. In terms of challenges, there is no showstoppers that we have. Again, a lot of the whole design philosophy is to have a system which is a collection of known industrial materials and processes, and that have well-established supply chains and regulatory history. So that's great, because it means that we're not going to be too surprised by anything. But the one thing that's proven to be probably the most challenging for us is to find the right type of graphite moderator, because there hasn't been a lot of use of graphite as a moderator in recent times in the nuclear energy industry, although there are still several systems operating in the UK and Russia which do, but a lot of the expertise that was used to fabricate that graphite is long gone. So that is something that we have to recreate, and we have to scrounge for the few remnants of expertise that still does exist, and try to formulate that into a supply chain. So that's yes, that is tricky, but it's not a showstopper by any means.
I recall hearing that the Russians also have a molten salt reactor or two operating. Are you aware of those?
No.
No? Okay.
No, that's not true. What they do have is they have a commercial scale fast breeder reactor called the BN 800, which is actually, it was commissioned in 2016, and that is a Generation 4 system. It's the first and so far the only Generation 4 system operating at commercial scale in the world. Is based on the BN, I believe, 600, which has been operating since the 80s. And it is being used as the model for the BN 1200, which is, I believe, intended to be a commercial system which they want to deploy around the world. So these are Generation 4 systems, and I think it's as far as I'm concerned, a brilliant proof point that Generation 4 nuclear systems are not some unicorn technology which is 20, 30, 40 years in the future. It is here today. It has been operating for 5 years. There is an operating history, and there are probably about 6 or 7 other Generation 4 technologies that will have a commercial operating power plant before the end of this decade. So that goes to counterpoint all of the critics of advanced nuclear technology that like to say that these technologies are 20, 30, 40 years away. It's absolutely not the case.
So I'm interested in the the licensing requirements that you've had to navigate through. You say you started in 2012 and you've been working with CNSC for 5 years to get a judgment on the safety of your design. And from there on out, you're looking at another 8 or so years to get to an operating system. Are the licensing requirements reasonable, do you think? Are they overbearing? How quickly could you put your technology into practice without arbitrary licensing delays?
If there were a world that did not have nuclear regulation, well, first of all, I wouldn't want to live in that world. But let's say that there were such a place. My engineering friends have told me that, in fact, you could clap up a IMSR power plant in probably about 4 months. So, but again, regulation exists for a reason. I mean, it's you can't just have a free-for-all when it comes to nuclear technology. I think that goes without saying. But you asked me my opinion. Yes, my personal opinion is that the level of regulation that exists for nuclear energy is actually too much. I think it goes to a degree which is way beyond what would be required to achieve safety. And in one area in particular that really kind of bothers me, that is the level of radioactive exposure, radiation exposure. The nuclear regulators of the world and the health physics people of the world have taken the view that no level of radiation exposure is healthy, and that is simply not borne out by the data. It's simply not true. The dose limits that are imposed on us, you, me, the human population, are orders of magnitude lower than what would actually be safe. And so you might think, well, that's probably a good thing. They're making extra special careful that we're all going to be safe from radiation. But actually, I say no. This comes with a lot of, when you overregulate by so much, it creates massive unnecessary costs. And I'm talking billions and billions of dollars a year, which are dumped into prevention of radiation exposure to people that is not at all dangerous. And those billions of dollars could be used for something else, medical care, scientific development, whatever you think would be a good use of capital resources. I do not believe those funds are being well utilized in fighting something which has zero chance of being dangerous to anybody. So in that sense, yes, I think that the regulation is way offside and making far too many demands on a technology which could be safe at so much potentially higher levels of radiation. So as a matter of fact, there is a theory out there that small amounts of radiation are actually good for your health. It sounds crazy and counterintuitive to the prevailing belief system, which is that radiation is deadly and it'll give you cancer and it'll give your children and your grandchildren cancer and so on. And it's simply not true. I mean, it's a fairy tale.
Yeah.
It's a useful fairy tale for people that don't like nuclear energy.
It's been built up, I think, over the years by the anti-nuclear groups and push to make nuclear because without this, nuclear is so much more cheap than any other energy form that why would anyone burn fossil fuels, right? The fact is that these arbitrary cost structures create a dichotomy of regulatory regimes. You have nuclear where you have to have as low as reasonably possible. You can't kill anybody, and that's great, right? We don't want to kill anybody. We want it to be safe. But then somebody can go and build a gas plant in a year, and they don't need to have you don't need to have, all of this licensing. Well, okay, so you're going to be killing how many people per year from your fossil fuel air pollution? Nobody asks these questions. They're allowed to do it. It's a huge double standard that has been put in place by the lobbying industry, and I think it's dangerous for society as well, because this doesn't even take into account the climate change impacts of delaying nuclear and keeping the fossil fuels burning.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So yeah, don't get me started.
It represents a gross misallocation of resources, and you're right. I mean, the fossil fuel plants or cars or any kind of machine that uses fossil fuels is never called upon to maintain the same standard that nuclear energy is called upon to adhere to, which is zero harm to anybody, which it totally achieves year in and year out, every single year, all but one, 1986. Every year since the inception of the civilian energy industry in 1956. So what is that, 65 years ago? 64 of those years, it has achieved the zero harm to anybody.
Yeah.
With the exception of 1986, Chernobyl. Okay, 32 people were harmed, in fact, killed by an accident. But, if you look at all the thousands of coal plants and ships that burn bunk oil that circle the globe hundreds of times over every day, or the airplanes that thousands of flights every day, I mean, are they ever called upon to do zero harm to anybody? No.
Imagine what our society would cost if every fossil fuel burning application had to capture its waste exhaust and bury it in a geological repository. Imagine how the cost would shift.
Well, we would not have an industrial society if that were the case. we would be living in the Iron Age, the Bronze Age.
So, with all of this, all of these shackles of regulations, how much are you envisioning a terrestrial energy 200 megawatt electrical generator is going to cost in the future? What are you projecting, $1 billion per reactor?
The principal goal of the company is to develop an energy system which is affordable. Not just affordable for the 32 nuclear nations of the world, but to all nations, including smaller economies. The way conventional nuclear is done today, in most everywhere except China and Russia and maybe Korea, is great big massive facilities, multiples of gigawatts of electric power capacity, costing in the neighborhood of $8 to $10 billion per gigawatt of built out capacity, and requiring anywhere from 8 to 20 years to build. That is not a robust economic formula.
I think China's doing a little bit better.
Yes, well, that was my qualifier, not including China, Russia, and maybe Korea, right? So China is routinely building nuclear power facilities for under $4 a watt, in most cases under $3 a watt, since the turn of the century. So about 72 nuclear power plants have been commissioned since the year 2000. 49 of those have been from China and Russia, and vast majority of those have been sub $3 a watt capital cost. So that is a pretty different, and the construction times are also totally acceptable from a private sector capital perspective. So notwithstanding the exceptions to the rule, it's a economic calculus that just doesn't work. So terrestrial energy was created to try to recreate the formula. And that formula is building a nuclear facility for under $1 billion, being built and licensed on a timely basis. One of the aspects of the design that might help us do that is the M in SMR modular It means that the reactors can be built in a centralized assembly line facility, similar to, let's say, the Boeing facility in Everett, Washington. Now, it just so happens to be the largest industrial facility in the world. But IMSRs are orders of magnitude less complicated to build than a Boeing jet. So we could have an industrial facility, which is an assembly line manufacturing facility, where those reactors are built, and they're small enough that they can be shipped to the power plant, the nuclear building, which is built, near where the power is needed, near a suburb or wherever it is. And the manufacturing facility itself can be regulated, similar to the way that Boeing jets are regulated at the manufacturing facility. So that represents the potential for some big efficiencies that are now becoming possible in the nuclear energy industry. If we're successful in achieving our plans, we will build nuclear power plants around the world for under $1 billion, and we will build these plants in under 4 years. And we believe that represents an attractive economic proposition for private sector capital. And of course, those power plants will operate for at least 56 years, maybe much longer. And so you sort of pay off your capital in the first few years, and then you have a cash machine, a cash elephant, which is just vomiting cash for decades and delivering a very reliable, low-cost power for decades.
And is the core replacement, what fraction of the value would that be?
It's minuscule. These reactor cores are tremendously inexpensive to build, which is precisely why that is the design formula. I mean, it represents it's not even considered part of the capital cost. It's, let me put it to you this way. A conventional nuclear power plant, they have to reload new fuel assemblies into their reactors, generally speaking, around every 18 months. And a full reactor load of fuel assemblies costs on the order of $200 million. The cost of and so that fuel would have a useful life of about 18 to 24 months, let's say, or 18 to 36 months, let's say. Well, our replaceable reactor cores would be a small fraction of that, and they last for 7 years.
Wow.
So it's initially I can see how the idea of replacing the whole reactor core every 7 years would be jarring, and people might be tempted to think that is, from an economic perspective, not tenable. But as a matter of fact, it is eminently tenable because they are so inexpensive to build.
Interesting. That's really cool. Well, I think we're getting to the end of our time slot here. And so I really appreciate you coming on and talking to us about terrestrial energy. This has been a learning experience for me because I'm not studied very much on these new reactor technologies or old new reactor technologies, I guess, as this one is.
Yeah, that's the truer statement. We live in a very different world than the one we lived in the 60s and 70s in the Cold War. And having dual purpose civilian nuclear energy program is no longer relevant.
Indeed. I wish you all the luck in your development, and I hope you can get these things to market as quickly as the law will allow.
Well, thanks very much. I appreciate that.
Thank you for joining us on The Rational View.
Thanks for having me.
If you're enjoying what you're hearing, please consider visiting my Patreon page and becoming a patron of this podcast at patron.podbean.com/TheRationalView.